The first time the black wolf slept at Mara's door, every person in the village told her the same thing. Do not open it. Not for a whimper. Not for scratching. Not even if something outside sounded almost human. Because 5 winters before, Mara's father had held her hand, with fingers already cold from the forest, looked straight into her eyes, and made her promise one thing before he died: never open the door after sunset. So when the black wolf came night after night, lying so close to the threshold that its breath slipped under the crack like smoke, Mara obeyed. She sat beside the dying fire, knees pulled to her chest, listening to the animal breathe on the other side of the wood. Until one freezing night, the wolf lifted its paw, and underneath it, hidden against the snow, was a cub with blood darkening its fur. That was the moment Mara understood the door was not protecting her from the wolf. It was protecting her from the people who had followed it. And before this story is over, that poor girl will have to break the last promise she ever made to her father, pick up the hunting horn he left behind, and decide whether the thing she feared most in the world had been guarding her all along. If stories about courage, loyalty, and the strange ways love returns to us find a place in your heart, subscribe now and stay with this one to the end. Because the question in this story is not just whether Mara should open the door. It is whether a promise still means obedience, when obeying it lets something innocent die. Mara lived at the far edge of a northern village called Briarfen, where the pine trees leaned so close to the cottages that their branches scraped the roofs when the wind rose. She was 19, though hard winters and thin meals had taught her to move like someone older. Her house was the last one before the forest path narrowed into darkness. It had 2 small windows, a roof patched with bark shingles, and a door her father had carved himself from black oak. People in Briarfen called it the widow door, though Mara had never been married. They called it that because once you crossed beyond her yard, there were no more houses, no more lamps, no more voices, only trees, ravines, and the old hunting trails where men sometimes went in and did not come back. Mara's father, Thomas, had been one of the best trackers in the valley. He was not rich, not important, and not much loved by the men who traded pelts in the village square. He had a quiet way about him that made cruel men nervous. He knew when snares had been set too low, when traps had been baited for more than food, when a hunter's story did not match the tracks in snow. Mara remembered him as broad-shouldered and gentle, the kind of man who could mend a broken chair, carry a lamb through a blizzard, and sit for an hour beside a frightened horse until it lowered its head into his hands. Around his neck, he always wore an old hunting horn made from pale bone and dark leather. He said it was not for calling prey, it was for calling help. Then, one night when Mara was 14, Thomas came home from the forest with a tear in his coat, frost in his beard, and a look in his eyes that frightened her more than any wound could have. He barred the door before he even spoke. Mara had run to him, asking what happened, but he only gripped her shoulders and listened. Outside, deep in the trees, something cried. It was not exactly a woman, not exactly a child. It rose and broke and rose again, thin as thread, pitiful enough to pull tears from anyone with a heart. Mara had turned toward the door. Her father pulled her back so sharply she stumbled. Then he said, in a voice she had never heard from him before, that she must remember this for the rest of her life. No matter what begged, no matter what scratched, no matter whose voice she thought she heard, she must never open the door after sunset. 3 days later, fever took him. He died before telling her what he had seen. From that day on, Mara kept the rule as if it were the last living piece of him. At sunset, she closed the shutters, set the iron latch, dropped the bar across the door, and hung her father's horn on the peg beside the hearth, where she could see it. Years passed. Her hands grew rough from washing linen for wealthier families. Her boots wore thin. Her neighbors were not unkind, but poverty has a way of making a person almost invisible. They gave advice more freely than bread. They told her to sell the horn, sell the cottage, sell the last of her father's tools. Mara refused. The horn stayed. The door stayed shut. And then the wolf came. It was early winter when Mara first noticed the tracks. She found them at dawn, pressed deep into the snow outside her threshold, bigger than a dog's, wider than her palm. They circled the cottage once, passed beneath the window, then stopped before the door as if the animal had stood there watching the house while she slept. Mara told herself it was nothing. Wolves sometimes came near the village when the forest was hungry, but the next morning, the tracks were there again. And the next. On the fourth night, she heard it. Not a howl, not a growl, just the soft weight of a body settling against her door. Mara froze with a spoon halfway to her mouth. The fire snapped. The wind nudged at the shutters. Something outside exhaled. She stood very slowly, crossed the room without making the floorboards creak, and leaned toward the little knothole her father had left near the hinge. Through it, she saw a black shape folded on the snow. A wolf. Its coat was so dark, it looked like the forest had torn off a piece of night and laid it at her doorstep. Its ears were high. Its muzzle rested on its paws, but its eyes were open, fixed not on the window, not on the latch, but past her shoulder, at the horn. Mara stepped back. The wolf did not scratch. It did not throw itself at the door. It did not whine like the cries from her childhood. It simply stayed there until dawn, and when the first pale light touched the snow, it rose and vanished between the trees. By the seventh night, the village knew. Old Nessa from the well saw the tracks and crossed herself. The miller's sons came to stare until Mara shouted at them to leave. At the market, men lowered their voices when she passed, though not enough that she could not hear. A black wolf at a door means death. Maybe it smelled sickness in her. Maybe her father angered something in those woods. Maybe the girl feeds it. The worst whispers came from a hunter named Garrick Venn. Garrick had arrived in Briarfen 2 years earlier with a silver-handled knife, 3 hard-faced men, and enough coin to buy permission from people who should have known better. He trapped beyond the legal lines. He brought pelts in numbers that made older hunters uneasy. He smiled without warmth and spoke of the forest as if it were a warehouse he had not finished emptying. Mara disliked him from the first time she saw him kick snow over a fox's blood trail and laugh. When he heard about the wolf, he came to her cottage before sunset with 2 of his men behind him. He did not knock like a neighbor. He struck the door with the butt of his spear. Mara opened only the upper half of the split door and kept the lower bar in place. Garrick smiled at that. He had a narrow face, pale eyes, and a trimmed beard that made him look cleaner than he was. He said he had heard she had a visitor. Mara told him she had heard many things in the village that were not worth repeating. His smile thinned. He leaned closer and asked whether the wolf had been injured, whether it limped, whether it carried anything in its mouth. That question settled cold in Mara's stomach. Why would he ask that? She told him to leave. Garrick looked past her, and his eyes landed on the horn by the fire. For half a breath, his face changed. Recognition, maybe. Or annoyance. Then he tapped the lower door with one gloved finger and said if the wolf came again, she should send word to men who knew what to do. Mara answered that if men knew what to do, there would be fewer dead things in the forest. His men muttered, but Garrick only laughed softly and stepped back. Before leaving, he told her that wolves were clever. They could wait. They could make people pity them. And pity, he said, was the easiest door to open. That night, Mara barred the door earlier than usual. The wolf came after moonrise. Again, it lay down. Again, it stared toward the horn. But this time, Mara noticed something else. The animal's right side rose and fell too fast, as if it had run far. Snow clung to its fur. It turned its head once toward the woods, alert, and a low sound moved through its chest. Not a threat. A warning. Mara slept little. Each time she drifted, she dreamed of her father barring the door, of that terrible crying in the trees, of his hand gripping her shoulder. When she woke before dawn, the wolf was gone. In the snow where it had lain, there was a faint smear of rust red. Mara knelt beside it with her shawl wrapped tight around her. The stain was not large, but it was fresh. She looked toward the forest and saw a second set of marks, almost hidden beneath the wolf's tracks. Smaller, uneven, dragging. A young animal. Her mouth went dry. For the first time, Mara wondered if the wolf had not come to threaten her. Maybe it had come because it remembered her father. That thought would not leave her. All day, as she hauled water and scrubbed shirts for the innkeeper's wife, she saw those smaller tracks. All evening, as she ate the last of her barley stew, she stared at the horn and wondered what kind of help it had once called. Then the temperature dropped. By sunset, the cold was so sharp that frost formed inside the window seams. The kindling smoked before it caught. The wind screamed through the pines and drove snow sideways across the yard. No animal should have been moving in that weather. Still, near midnight, the wolf came. Mara heard it hit the door, not with force, but with exhaustion, a heavy body sliding down the wood. Then came a sound she had not heard before, a tiny, broken cry. Mara stopped breathing. The old promise rose inside her like a wall. Never open the door after sunset. The cub cried again, not loud, not dramatic, just small and fading. Mara moved to the door and pressed her palm against it. The wood was ice cold. On the other side, the wolf huffed once, almost as if it knew she was there. She looked back at the horn. She saw her father's hands carving notches into its leather strap. She heard his voice telling her that fear could keep a person alive, but it could also keep them from doing what was right. Had he said that? Or had she invented it because she needed him to give permission? The cub's cry sank into a shiver. Mara whispered that she was sorry. Then she lifted the bar. If you were standing in that room, with the last promise of someone you loved on one side and a dying creature on the other, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments, because Mara's choice was the kind that can haunt a person either way. And if you are still watching, give the story a like. so more people who love emotional animal mysteries can find it. The door opened only a hand's width before the wolf's head rose. Mara almost dropped the lamp. Up close, the animal was enormous. Its eyes were amber, ringed with frost. A scar cut through the fur above one cheek. Its breath rolled white into the room. Every instinct in Mara told her to slam the door shut. But the wolf did not lunge. It lifted its front paw. Beneath it lay a cub, no bigger than a bundle of firewood, black like its mother or father, but with a patch of gray at the throat. One of its back legs was caught in a loop of twisted wire, and near its shoulder, dark fur clumped around a small wound. Mara's fear changed shape. It became anger, not at the wolf, at whoever had done this. She opened the door wider. The wolf tensed, lips parting just enough to show teeth. Mara lowered herself slowly, keeping her eyes down the way her father had taught her around frightened animals. She told the wolf she would not take the cub far. She did not know if it understood the words, but it understood something in her tone. It backed away one step, then another, never taking its gaze from her hands. Mara wrapped the cub in her shawl and brought it inside. The wolf remained at the threshold. She did not invite it in. It did not try to enter. Snow gathered on its back while Mara worked by lamplight, hands shaking from cold and fear. The wire had bitten into the cub's leg, but not deeply enough to ruin it if she moved fast. She fetched her father's small pliers, cleaned them in the fire, and cut the loop strand by strand. The cub whimpered once. The black wolf rose so quickly Mara thought it would cross the threshold. She froze. The wolf froze too. For a long moment, they looked at each other across the line of the door. Mara whispered that if it wanted the cub to live, it had to let her finish. The wolf lowered its head. That was the first bargain between them. Mara washed the wound with warm water and crushed yarrow. When she parted the fur near the cub's shoulder, something hard glinted beneath the dried blood. At first, she thought it was a thorn. Then she gripped it with cloth and drew it out. A broken arrowhead, not iron from the village forge. Bone-edged steel, shaped with a little split at the base, so it could be tied fast to a narrow shaft. Mara knew that design. Her father had made arrowheads that way because they flew true and could be removed cleanly if they struck wrong. He had taught her to recognize them when she was small. She still had 3 in a leather pouch inside his old quiver. Her fingers went numb. She carried the arrowhead to the chest beneath her bed and opened it. Inside lay her father's quiver, wrapped in cloth. She untied it and pulled out one of the old points. The match was nearly perfect, but the one from the cub was newer, sharper, made by someone copying the pattern, or by someone using the arrows her father had left behind. Mara sat back on her heels as the room tilted around her. After Tomas died, several of his hunting tools had gone missing. At the time, she had thought neighbors had borrowed them and forgotten to return them, or that she herself had misplaced things in the fog of grief. Now she wondered who had taken them. At the door, the black wolf stared at the arrowhead in her hand. Then, very slowly, it looked toward the horn. Mara understood nothing fully yet, but she felt the shape of a truth moving beneath the surface. Her father's warning, Garrick's questions, the wolf appearing at the horn, the copied arrowhead in the cub's shoulder. This was not random. The wolf had brought the cub to her because of Thomas. By dawn, the cub slept in a basket lined with Mara's spare skirt. The wolf had not moved from the threshold, though the storm had laid snow against its flank. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, Mara expected it to leave. Instead, it stood, looked once at the cub, and walked toward the forest. After 10 paces, it stopped. It looked back at Mara. No human could mistake that invitation. Mara should have stayed. She should have gone to the village. She should have shown the arrowhead to someone with authority. Though Briarfin's authority often looked away when coin changed hands. Instead, she wrapped the horn around her shoulder, tucked the broken arrowhead into her pocket, and followed the black wolf into the trees. The forest, after a storm, was unnaturally quiet. Snow softened every step. Branches bowed low. The wolf moved like a shadow ahead of her, sometimes disappearing between trunks, then waiting until she caught up. It did not behave like a tame animal. It did not belong to her. But it guided her. After nearly an hour, Mara recognized the ground. She had not walked that way since childhood, but memory opened under her feet. A narrow ridge, a split birch, a stream hidden beneath ice. Her father had once brought her there in summer to gather berries, and when thunder rolled over the valley, he had carried her on his back all the way home. The wolf led her beyond the berry slopes to a ravine, where the earth dropped sharply into blue shadow. There, beneath a ledge of stone, lay the remains of an old campsite. Not recent, not abandoned last week or last year, old enough that moss had crawled over the stones. But some things remained because winter kept secrets well. A rusted buckle, a snapped trap chain, a strip of leather nailed into a tree, and carved into the bark beside it, half healed over, was her father's mark. Thomas had marked safe paths with a small crescent cut by 2 lines. Mara touched it with gloved fingers and felt tears rise before she understood why. The wolf descended into the ravine, then stopped beside a flat stone stained dark under the snow. It sniffed the place once, then looked at Mara. A memory struck her so hard she nearly sat down. Her father, years ago, coming home with his sleeve torn and his eyes changed. A sound crying outside. His fevered voice saying he had made a mistake. No, not a mistake. A mercy. Then he had lost the sentence to coughing. Mara brushed snow from the flat stone. Under it was a small hollow, and inside the hollow, wrapped in oilskin gone stiff with age, was a notebook. Her father's notebook. For a few seconds, she could not open it. Her hand shook too badly. When she finally loosened the wrap, she found pages filled with Thomas's careful writing. Not daily thoughts, records, names, dates, tracks found, traps removed. Men seen near the North Ravine after dark, and on the last written page, a line that made the forest spin around her. They are using cries to lure doors open. Not wolves. Men. Mara read on. Her father had discovered that a group of illegal hunters were moving through the valley at night, imitating distress calls to draw animals, and sometimes people toward hidden snares. If a farmer came out believing a child was lost, the hunters frightened him into silence. If a traveler followed the sound, he might lose his horse, his pack, or worse, though Thomas had written only enough to be clear and not enough to be cruel. Then came a passage about a black she-wolf caught in one of those traps. Thomas had found her at dawn, wounded, snarling, still alive. By law and by custom, most men would have killed her and taken the pelt. But Thomas had seen that she was nursing. Somewhere nearby, cubs needed her. So he cut the trap chain, risked his hands, and freed her. The last lines were written unevenly, as if he had been in a hurry. Garrick Venn has my arrows. I saw the fletching. He wants the Black Wolf because she knows his camp and has learned his calls. If I do not return before dark, Mara must not open the door. He can make anything sound helpless." Mara lowered the notebook. The forest around her blurred. Her father had not made the rule because he feared wolves. He had made it because he feared men who knew how to use mercy against the merciful. The Black Wolf had not come to her door as a curse. It had come because once, when it was caught and helpless, Thomas had opened his hands instead of closing them. A sound snapped Mara back. Far above the ravine, a twig broke. The wolf's ears shot forward. Mara slipped the notebook under her coat. The Black Wolf climbed silently toward the ridge, but before it reached the top, a voice called out through the trees. It was Garrick. He said Mara's name as if they had arranged to meet. She turned and saw him standing between two pines, with 3 men behind him. Their coats were whitewashed for snow cover. One held a coil of wire. Another carried a short bow. Garrick's eyes moved from Mara to the wolf, then to the horn against her chest. He said he had wondered when the old tracker's daughter would finally become curious. Mara's heart pounded so hard, she thought the men could hear it. Garrick told her not to be foolish. He said the wolf was dangerous. The cub would fetch a fine price alive, and her father's old records belonged to no one now. If she had found anything in the ravine, she should hand it over before she got herself accused of poaching. Mara laughed once, not because it was funny, but because fear had nowhere else to go. Poaching. From him. The Black Wolf stood between Mara and the men, head low, silent. Garrick raised his bow slightly, not enough to shoot, enough to remind everyone he could. Mara's fingers brushed the horn. She could blow it. She wanted to. But she did not know what would answer, or from where, or whether it would come in time. And if the wolf pack came while Garrick had bows drawn, the ravine might become a place of panic instead of rescue. So Mara made a different choice. She stepped away from the wolf. The animal's head jerked toward her. Mara did not look at it. She looked only at Garrick and let her shoulders slump the way villagers expected poor girls to slump when powerful men cornered them. She told him she had found nothing but old paper ruined by damp. She said the cub was at her cottage, alive for now, and if he wanted it, he would need her help to keep it that way. Garrick studied her. He was clever enough to suspect a lie, but greedy enough to hope for a bargain. Mara said the cub had fever. If moved too roughly, it would die before he sold it. She could treat it for 2 days. After that, she would give it to him in exchange for enough coin to leave Briarfen. The words tasted like ash. The wolf made the lowest growl Mara had ever heard. Garrick smiled. There it was, the thing he believed about everyone, that love, loyalty, and memory could all be priced if the number was high enough. He told Mara he would come after moonrise, when the village slept. He warned her that if she spoke to anyone before then, he would tell the reeve she had been sheltering a dangerous animal and stealing from legal traps. Mara nodded, as if frightened into agreement. She was frightened, but not into agreement. When Garrick and his men withdrew, the Black Wolf turned on her with such hurt fury that Mara had to force herself not to step back. Its teeth showed. Its eyes burned. She whispered that she was not giving him the cub. The wolf did not soften. Mara pulled the notebook from under her coat and held it out, then pointed toward the village, toward her cottage, toward the horn. She did not know how much the animal understood. But after a long, terrible moment, the wolf closed its mouth. Trust, Mara learned then, was not a warm feeling. Sometimes trust was standing close to fear, and not running. They returned by a different path. Mara moved quickly, thinking through every detail. She could not ask the reeve for help. He owed Garrick too much money. She could not gather the villagers openly. Half would be afraid, and the other half would warn Garrick by accident. She could not fight armed men. She had no brothers, no husband, no wealth, no influence. But she had the cottage at the edge of the forest. She had her father's horn. She had a wounded cub Garrick wanted alive. And she had a wolf pack somewhere in the trees that had not forgotten Thomas. Back at the cottage, the cub woke and licked weakly at Mara's fingers. The tenderness of it nearly broke her. She fed it broth with a rag twisted into a teat. She changed the bandage. She spoke softly while the black wolf watched from outside the open lower door, never crossing the threshold. Mara wondered then if the wolf also obeyed a rule. Maybe it would not enter a human home because once, long ago, it had learned that doors could be traps. By afternoon, Mara began to prepare, not for a battle, for a turning of the hunter's own method against them. Her father had taught her that snares worked because panic narrowed the mind. The trapped creature pulled against the same pain until it tired. To escape, you had to stop pulling and see the shape of the trap. Garrick's trap was secrecy, night, fear, the belief that Mara was alone. She would break the first two quietly and use the third against him. She went to old Nessa's house before dusk with a bundle of laundry and her father's notebook hidden inside. Nessa had been friends with Thomas when they were young. She was nearly 70, sharp-tongued, half-deaf when she wanted to avoid gossip, and perfectly able to hear coins drop in the market square. Mara did not tell her everything. She told her enough. She showed the page with Garrick's name. She showed the copied arrowhead. She asked Nessa to keep the notebook safe until morning, and, if Mara did not come by sunrise, to carry it to the abbey, 2 villages east, where the reeve's debts meant nothing. Nessa read the page twice. Then she looked at Mara for a long time and said, Thomas had once saved her son from a winter trap. She had wondered when Briarfin would repay him. Mara asked her not to come to the cottage. It would be too dangerous. Nessa snorted and said at her age, danger would have to wait its turn. But she agreed to stay away unless she heard the horn. At sunset, Mara returned home. This time she did not bar the door. She left it closed, but unlatched. She banked the fire low. She placed the cub's basket near the hearth, where it could be seen from the threshold. Then she hung the horn around her neck and sat in the dark. Outside, the black wolf lay beneath the window, hidden in shadow. Minutes crawled. The cold deepened. The village lamps disappeared one by one behind the snow haze. Mara listened to the cub's breathing, to the wind, to her own pulse. Near midnight, a cry came from the trees. Mara closed her eyes. It was the same sound from her childhood. A thin, shaken plea. A voice that seemed to say, "Help me," without words. It rose between the pines, broke, and drifted toward the cottage. For 5 years, that sound had lived in Mara's memory as something monstrous. Now she heard the human flaw inside it, the pause for breath, the controlled pitch, the way it aimed itself at the heart. Not a ghost, not a wolf, a man making mercy into bait. The latch lifted. Garrick entered first, bow in hand, with 2 men behind him. The third remained outside. His eyes found the cub immediately. Then Mara, seated by the hearth, with her hands folded like someone defeated. He said she had made a wise choice. Mara asked for the coin. Garrick laughed and told her wisdom should not become greed. That was when she knew fully that he had never intended to pay her. Perhaps he had intended to frighten her into silence. Perhaps to leave her with a story no one would believe. But the cub would not leave with him. Garrick stepped toward the basket. The black wolf appeared in the doorway behind him. No growl, no warning. Just the sudden shape of night filling the threshold. The men startled. One cursed. Garrick swung his bow around, but Mara kicked the stool into his knees with all the force she had. It was not graceful. It was not heroic, the way stories make such moments sound. The stool cracked. Garrick stumbled. The arrow meant for the wolf struck the doorframe instead. Mara seized the cub's basket and ran for the back room. A hand caught her sleeve. Cloth tore. She twisted free, slammed her shoulder into the pantry door, and dropped behind the flour chest as a man lunged after her. Then she blew the horn. The sound was not beautiful. It was raw, deep, and larger than the cottage. It rolled through the room, through the open door, across the yard, and into the forest like a voice older than language. For one breath, nothing happened. Garrick shouted for his men to grab her. Then the forest answered, not with one howl, with many. They rose from the north ridge, the creek bed, the pines behind the smokehouse, the dark beyond the well road. The sound surrounded the cottage until the walls seemed to tremble with it. Garrick's men stopped moving. The one in the pantry doorway went pale. Mara blew the horn again. The black wolf sprang, not at a throat, not with the savage detail fear invents, but straight into the space between Garrick and the cub. It knocked him back hard enough that his bow skidded across the floor. Outside, shadows moved over the snow. Wolves, 6 or 7 of them, circled the yard, eyes catching moonlight. Garrick's men broke first. One ran through the front door and stopped dead at the sight of the pack. Another backed into the wall, hands raised, as if surrendering to animals that did not understand surrender. Garrick reached for his knife, then looked at Mara. She expected rage. What she saw was calculation collapsing into fear. He was not brave without control. Mara stood with the cub basket in one arm and the horn in her other hand. She told him to leave his weapons on the floor. He spat that she had no authority. Mara said no, but the wolves had no use for authority. The black wolf stepped closer to Garrick, not attacking, choosing. That was enough. One by one, the men dropped their bows, knives, and wire coils. Mara ordered them outside and toward the old goat shed, a sturdy little building with an outside latch. The wolves paced them across the yard. No one was harmed. No blood was needed. Fear did what violence would only have complicated. When Garrick realized she meant to lock them in until morning, he changed his tone. He said she was making a mistake. He said he could explain. He said her father had been stubborn, that no one meant for him to get sick, that the winter would have killed him anyway. Mara stopped with her hand on the shed latch. The words entered her slowly. No one meant for him to get sick. She turned. Garrick saw too late that he had given away more than he intended. Mara asked what he had done. He looked at the wolves, then at the horn, then at the dark cottage behind her. The pack waited in a wide circle, silent now. The black wolf stood at Mara's side. Garrick swallowed and said Thomas had followed them that night. He had freed the wolf. He had taken the notebook. Garrick and his men had chased him, but Thomas knew the ravines too well. They had used the distress call outside his cottage later, hoping to draw him out or frighten him into returning the records. Thomas did not open the door. He never did. But he had already been hurt by the cold and by the struggle in the ravine. Fever did the rest. Mara's hand tightened on the latch. There would have been a time when those words would have emptied her. But grief had lived in her for 5 years. It had grown roots, changed seasons, become part of her strength. She did not need Garrick to confess in a hall. She did not need him to weep. She needed him unable to hurt anything else that came to her door. She shut the goat shed and dropped the latch. Then she wedged her father's old axe handle through the ring. Inside, Garrick shouted threats until the black wolf gave one short bark. After that, there was silence. Mara stood in the snow, shaking so hard she could barely hold the basket. The pack began to drift back toward the trees. One by one, gray shapes vanished into black trunks. The black wolf remained. Mara looked at it and finally understood why it had never crossed the threshold. It had been asking, yes, begging perhaps, but it had also been waiting for her to choose. Thomas had once chosen to open Mercy's door for it. Mara had to choose for herself. The cub stirred in the basket. The wolf stepped forward, nose trembling. Mara knelt and set the basket on the snow. The cub lifted its head, saw the black wolf, and made a small sound that was almost a squeak. The wolf lowered its muzzle and touched the cub so gently Mara had to look away. Not because it was sad, because tenderness can be harder to watch than fear. At dawn, old Nessa arrived with 3 villagers, 2 lanterns, and a face that suggested she had enjoyed ignoring Mara's instruction to stay away. Behind them came the abbey warden, whom Nessa had apparently sent for the moment Mara left her house. The notebook was safe. The weapons in Mara's cottage matched the copied arrowheads. The wire coils matched the snares found near the ravine. Garrick and his men were taken east before the village could decide whether coin still mattered more than truth. There was no grand speech in the square, no crowd cheering Mara's name. Briarfen was not the kind of place that changed all at once. Some people apologized. Some avoided her eyes. The Reeve suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. By noon, everyone had a version of the story that made them less guilty for not listening sooner. Mara did not care as much as she thought she would. She was too tired, too full, too aware of the cub sleeping by her hearth with its bandaged leg twitching in dreams. For 3 days, the black wolf stayed near the cottage while the cub healed. It did not sleep directly at the door anymore. It chose the edge of the yard, beneath the pine where morning sun touched first. Mara left broth outside. The wolf ignored it. She left water. The wolf drank only when she went back inside. On the 4th evening, the cub stood. It wobbled, fell into the basket, sneezed, and tried again. Mara laughed for the first time in so long the sound startled her. The black wolf watched through the open door. Open, though sunset had passed. That mattered. Mara still respected the night. She still closed the door when wind rose. She still listened carefully to sounds from the trees. But the rule had changed inside her. It was no longer a chain tied to fear. It had become what her father meant it to be, a warning to think, to listen, to know the difference between a cry that asks for help and a cry that hunts your kindness. On the 7th morning, the cub was strong enough to leave. Mara knew before she opened her eyes. The cottage felt different, the way a room feels when a guest has put on their coat before saying goodbye. She found the cub at the threshold, leaning against the black wolf's leg. The wolf looked at Mara, and for the first time, there was no urgency in its gaze, no demand, no warning, only recognition. Mara wrapped her shawl around herself and stepped outside. Frost silvered the yard. The village smoke rose thin beyond the hill. The forest waited, immense and alive. She knelt before the cub and touched 2 fingers to the gray patch at its throat. It licked her once, quick and warm. Then it limped to the wolf. The black wolf turned toward the trees, but after a few steps, it stopped beside the old stump where Mara's father used to split wood. Snow had melted there in a narrow ring, revealing something half buried in the earth. Mara walked over and dug it free. It was a small brass buckle from her father's old pack. She did not know whether the wolf had found it and brought it, or whether it had lain there for years waiting for thaw. But on the back, scratched with a knife tip, were 3 letters. M.T.H. Mara Thomas's heart. Her father had carved silly messages into things when she was small. She remembered laughing at that one. She had thought it lost. She held the buckle to her chest, and this time, grief came clean, not as a wound ripped open, as snowmelt, cold, clear, moving. The black wolf watched until Mara stood. Then it led the cub into the forest. At the tree line, the cub looked back once. The black wolf did not. It did not need to. Some goodbyes are not endings. They are proof that what was saved can return to where it belongs. After that winter, Mara's cottage changed. Not all at once. Poverty did not vanish because a wolf trusted her. But people came differently now. A farmer brought flour and pretended he had milled too much. Nessa came every other day with advice Mara had not requested, and soup she secretly needed. The Abbey warden sent word that reward money from Garrick's seized pelts would be divided among those harmed by his traps. Mara received enough to repair the roof, buy proper boots, and refuse any suggestion that she sell the cottage. She also became the person people came to when they heard something strange after dark. Not because she was fearless, because she had learned fear's language. She could tell a fox's bark from a child's cry, an owl's scream from a trickster's call, a lost goat from a staged plea. She taught children never to run blindly toward a sound in the woods. She taught hunters to mark their traps honestly or lose them. She kept her father's notebook on the shelf beside the horn, and when someone asked why she did not hide such painful things away, she said memory only became dangerous when locked in darkness. 1 month after the cub left, Mara found tracks outside her door again. Large wolf tracks. Beside them, smaller ones. They did not stop at the threshold this time. They crossed the yard, circled the pine, and disappeared toward the ridge. No blood. No dragging. No plea. Just passing through. Mara stood in the doorway with the horn in her hands and smiled. That night, she closed the door after sunset. She set the bar in place, not because she believed every visitor was a threat, and not because she would never open it again. Because wisdom is not the opposite of mercy. Wisdom is what lets mercy survive. Before the fire burned low, she took out her father's notebook and added a page of her own. Her handwriting was not as neat as his. Her first lines wavered. Then they steadied. The black wolf came to my door for 7 nights. I was afraid and obeyed the rule. On the 8th, I opened it and found a cub. Father's warning was true, but not the whole truth. The danger was not the cry. The danger was those who used it. I will keep the door. I will keep the horn. And I will keep listening. She let the ink dry. Outside, far beyond the last cottage, a wolf howled. Mara rose and opened the shutter, just a little. The sound rolled over Briarfen, not lonely, not threatening, but full and wild and alive. Somewhere out there, a cub with a gray throat was learning the paths. Somewhere out there, the black wolf still knew the way to her door. Mara touched the horn, then the door her father had built. For years, she had thought the promise meant never open. Now she understood what he had truly left her. Do not open blindly. Do not let fear decide for you. Do not let cruel voices borrow the sound of need. And when the helpless are truly at your threshold, be brave enough to know the difference. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more emotional long-form stories like this, and leave a comment with your answer. Was Mara right to break her father's last rule, or was the rule only fulfilled when she finally understood it? And if you know someone who believes kindness is weakness, share this with them. Because sometimes the thing sleeping at your door is not the danger. Sometimes it is the warning. And sometimes, beneath its paw, is the life you were meant to save.